What is up, DS3 TV? We are back for another video, and yeah, this one is Kings and Generals. This is a recommended video by a subscriber, and yeah, this is the Battle of Plassey, 1757. British conquest of India begins, and yeah, so this should be a pretty good video, and let's get into it because we always do love Kings and Generals on this channel. Also, subscribe to the channel. I want to get 1,000 subscribers by my birthday, September 13th, and yeah, let's get into it and play.
The British conquest of India is perhaps the most defining chapter of modern South Asian history. However, the seizure of one of the oldest and largest civilizations on Earth was by no means a foregone conclusion, and ultimately came down to luck, conspiracy, and a conveniently placed grove of mango trees. Welcome to our...
That's a very interesting start into the video. I kind of, I know that, I definitely know the British conquest of India, was a major shift and change for the subcontinent, like how it was for Africa and the America as a whole. The Americas changed drastically after Britain came. Even, when Britain and Spain came. So yeah, that had a big cultural shift on the whole entire world whenever they went somewhere, because of all of the enslaving and stuff that they had done too.
Video on the crucial Battle of Plassey and the beginnings of an era of colonialism from Pakistan to Tamil Nadu, whose legacy affects some 1.8 billion people living today. Shout out to Dragon Champions for sponsoring this video. Dragon Champions is the legendary free-to-play mobile RPG game available on iOS and Android. Players below level 15 who haven't used other promo codes will receive a special bonus worth $10. You can get 500 Dracoins, 250,000 gold 18th century, trading outposts run by the Portuguese, French 18th century, trading outposts run by the Portuguese, French, Danish, Dutch and English traders dotted the Indian coastline, all seeking the peppers, cloves and pearls of the East. At this time, the Europeans had not the numbers or firepower to conquer India, and the dominant power in the subcontinent was the Mughal Empire. It was, however, highly decentralized, often leaving the regional lords, the Nawabs, to fend for themselves. In that regard, these Nawabs often hired armed European trading corporations to put down rebellions within their domain, the primary method by which many European traders established their bases in Indian lands. The most prominent of these soldiers of fortune
British East India Company
were of the Honourable East India Company, an independent mega-corporation in service of the Crown of Britain, with a government-mandated monopoly on British trade in India, and the ability to appoint its own governors, mint its own coin, and field its own army, which consisted both of European soldiers and Indians under the British payroll, known as sepoys. By the 1650s, the company had established trading bases in Bombay, Madras and Calcutta. The Europeans brought to India not just their ships, bullion and guns, but also their rivalries. Whenever war broke out in Europe, conflict would inevitably spill over into India. Nowhere was this as prevalent as in the Carnatic Wars. These were a series of 3 conflicts between 1746 and 1763 that saw Britain and France, the 2 largest colonial powers, battle for colonial dominance in India. The First Carnatic War was a relatively minor affair, and ran concurrently with the War of Austrian Succession in Europe. As France sided with Prussia and England with Austria, their respective East India corporations locked horns in the Far East. In 1746, a fleet of French warships bombarded and took the British fort at Madras. The local Nawab of Carnatic, a fierce British ally, raised a force of 10,000 men to retake the fort, but was repelled by a much smaller French force. Meanwhile, the British retaliated by laying siege to the French stronghold of Pondicherry in 1748, but were forced to withdraw at the onset of the monsoon rains. This short conflict ended with the conclusion of its parent war in Europe, and in the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, Madras was returned to Britain by the French in exchange for the fort of Louisbourg, which had been taken by the British all the way over in Canada. The First Carnatic War had been fought against the backdrop.
Something I've very much noticed is that Britain, whenever they get to to somewhere, they always act like that they're, well, not act like that, they're very similar to like roaches. It's like if you see one, usually more of them are gonna pop up. and it turns into a whole colonial empire after a while. That's how it seems to me, at least.
Of a great wave of geopolitical change in the Indian subcontinent. The old Mughal Empire was in a slow decline, and as it rotted from within, various ambitious Nawabs carved pieces out of its decaying body, creating smaller, functionally independent states that fought amongst themselves for land and prestige. So, even though the governments of Britain and France were nominally at peace, the British and French East India Companies continued to fight various proxy wars with one another, with both sides struggling to place local rulers on the throne they suspected would favour them over their fellow European rival. In 1749, a dynastic struggle erupted over the lordship of the Carnatic, and the Europeans quickly picked their sides. France backed the up-and-coming Chanda Sahib, while the British backed the well-established camp of Muhammad Ali Khan Walaja. At the onset, Sahib appeared to have the upper hand, taking control of most of the Carnatic, before besieging Walaja's last stronghold at Trincomalee in 1751. Victory seemed like a sure thing, for Sahib commanded 6,000 men and had a force of 1,800 Frenchmen by his side, while within the fort, Walaja and his British allies numbered only 1,600. Here enters a pivotal character in the story of colonial India, a young British officer named Robert Clive. A fast-thinking and intrepid commander, he mustered a force of 280 British soldiers and 300 sepoys and made a bold stab at the city of Arcot, the seat of Sahib's palace and a city of 100,000 souls. Arcot had been left sparsely defended, and amazingly, the city garrison abandoned their posts upon hearing word of Clive's dogged, nearly inhumanly impulsive strike at their city. Upon hearing of the seizure of his capital, Chanda Sahib was forced to divert troops from the siege at Trincomalee, relieving the Anglo-Indian force there. Not only had Clive defied all expectations and taken Arcot with a tiny force, he managed to defend it from a subsequent Franco-Indian counterattack 4,000 men strong. He proceeded to win several other battles over the next 2 years, developing a reputation as a brilliant commander with an aura of near invincibility. In 1754, the Treaty of Pondicherry elevated the British-backed Muhammad Ali Walaja to the Nawabship of the Carnatic, making the British the predominant European power in southeastern India. Meanwhile, the situation in the north of India was no less chaotic than in the south. One of the most prominent rising powers expanding at the expense of the Mughals was the Marathas. Proudly independent and fiercely warlike, they had broken free of Mughal control in the late 17th century, and in the following decades, the mounted Hindu warriors had rapidly conquered much of central India and were pushing upwards into Bengal. Bengal at the time was under the rulership of an ambitious Muslim Nawab, Alivadi Khan, who, much like the Nawabs of the Carnatic, pledged nominal loyalty to the rapidly fading illusion of imperial Mughal power, while in essence being the sovereign prince of a functionally independent realm. Alivadi managed to consistently fend off the perpetual Marathi attacks into his territory, but the raids simply kept coming and coming, and in 1751 he was forced to cede the borderland of Orissa and pay the Marathas an annual tribute. Alivadi was left in charge of a desolate and war-torn realm, and in order to rebuild the infrastructure that had been destroyed, he imposed heavy taxations upon the merchants in his lands. The well-established European factories along the Hooghly River were not exempt from this, and the British traders there grumbled mightily at their shakedown at the hands of this particularly iron-fisted Bengali prince. The situation was only further exacerbated when Alivadi Khan passed away in 1756, leaving his heir, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, in charge. Siraj was resentful of the economic and political influence the Europeans had in his domain, and also suspected the British of being part of a coup to dethrone him, though in fairness, he was probably right about that. The French...
I mean, I feel like everybody would assume so if they were pretty mad about paying taxes. More like heavier taxes than the normal would be if they didn't lose the land. So yeah, I could see that.
And British began to fortify their trading outposts in Bengal. Siraj immediately demanded they stop, and while the French complied, the British refused. This was all the casus belli the zealous Nawab needed. Siraj launched an assault on the British stronghold at Calcutta in June 1756, taking the city without a struggle, and seizing the lightly manned Fort William within it after only token resistance. English traders within the fort, some 146 men, were escorted into the dungeon, a holding cell intended only to contain 6 or fewer men. Left there for one full night, most of the Englishmen died of asphyxiation and heat stroke. Siraj-ud-Dowlah, for his part, seemed genuinely unaware. Nevertheless, the incident, which came to be known as the Black Hole of Calcutta, became emblazoned in the social memory of every Englishman in India, and steeled their resolve to retaliate against the Bengali prince. In Madras, the local governor of the East India Company resolved that Calcutta must be retaken immediately, and appointed the best man for the job, none other than a certain Major Robert Clive. In December 1756, Clive began up the Hooghly River, aboard a squadron of warships, commanding some 600 British soldiers and 900 sepoys. Between them and Calcutta was the Bengali fort of Budge Budge, but one humorous tale relates that while encamped outside it at night, a drunken British seaman stumbled inside the enemy fort by accident and stormed the barricades, taking the battery. After that, the squadron made it to Calcutta, thoroughly shelling the city with their cannons. By January 1757, the defending Bengali garrison quickly abandoned the city, allowing Clive and his men to retake a smouldering, ruined husk that had once been a thriving trade port. In response, Siraj mustered a huge army of 40,000 men, marching south to seize Calcutta once more. They arrived in February, setting up a siege camp outside of the city suburbs, where they engaged in some inconclusive skirmishes with the British garrison. Amidst this deadlock, it was once again the audacious Robert Clive who turned the tides. Creating a vanguard of East India sailors, soldiers and sepoys, he sailed a short distance down the Hooghly River under cover of night and a thick blanket of fog. Disembarking downriver, his marines reached the Bengali camp at 6 AM, at which point they began opening fire. Chaos consumed the encampment. Siraj's men shouted, tripped over themselves and fired blindly into the fog. Horses ran wild and elephants stampeded, all while Clive and his men continued to shoot their way through the camp, eventually making their way across the Bengali ditch and back into Fort William. Casualties were light. Clive lost only 57 men, while Siraj had lost 600 out of his total 40,000. Nevertheless, the Bengali prince sued for peace. On February 9th, the Treaty of Alinagar was signed between the company and Bengal. It was essentially status quo antebellum, with the British now able to fortify their outposts unopposed. With the Bengali problem pacified, the company turned its attention to France. The 7 Years' War was at full steam. On the 23rd of March 1757, The British launched a preemptive strike on the French outpost of Chandernagore. This attack infuriated Siraj-ud-Dowlah, who saw it as a blatant violation of the treaty he had just signed. He immediately began making overtures of alliance with the French in Cosim Bazar, conspiring with them to expel the British. Back in his court, a strong underground plot to overthrow the Bengali prince had grown, led by Siraj's scheming uncle, Mir Jafar. Clive found out about this plot, and on June 12, 1757, a treaty was signed between the company and the conspirators. For Clive, the time was nigh. There would be no better opportunity to overthrow the meddlesome Siraj-ud-Dowlah, install a friendly puppet government, and ensure British dominance in Bengal. Gathering a small army, he prepared to confront the Bengali prince in one final battle, and although no one knew it, it would be this battle that would decide the fate of all of India. Siraj had moved his army to a village on the Hooghly River. To the Indians it was known as Palashi, and to the English Plassey. At 1 AM on the 23rd of June 1757, Robert Clive's expedition arrived in the hinterlands outside Palashi, establishing their position in an orchard of mango trees protected by a ditch and a mud wall, adjacent from an old hunting lodge. Clive's force numbered about 3,000, consisting of 1,000 British redcoats, 2,000 Indian sepoys, 8 6-pounder cannons and 2 howitzers. The Bengali host, meanwhile, had encamped itself across the field a day earlier, in a camp adjacent to the river Bhagirathi, behind great earthen entrenchments and an elevated redoubt. It was a colossal horde of over 60,000 men, made up of 30,000 infantry armed with matchlock rifles, swords, pikes and rockets, as well as 20,000 cavalry armed with spears and swords. Towering over even this great mass were 50 24-pounder and 34-pounder cannons, mounted on huge wooden platforms, pulled on the backs of 40 oxen each, and flanked by armoured elephants. Finally, a detachment of Frenchmen, consisting of 50 artillerymen and 6 field guns, had attached themselves to the Nawab's cause, eager to lay their British enemies low. However, despite this massive show of force, almost 3/4 of Siraj's army was under the influence of Mir Jafar and his conspirators. Whether or not the scheming uncle would betray his lord or remain loyal would decide the fate of the battle. At the break of dawn, the Bengali army began to descend upon the small British force in a giant imposing arc that covered the entire Palashi plain. The French artillery moved ahead of the main line, positioning their field guns on either side of a large water tank, a half-mile away from the mango grove. They were followed by the right wing of the Bengali army, led by the only loyal generals in Siraj's army, the Muslim Mir Madan and the Hindu Mohan Lal. Meanwhile, Clive had squared up, ordering his men to advance out of the grove, forming a line just beyond its walls, while his own artillery formed a vanguard under the cover of a nearby brick kiln. The British were in a pickle. Clive knew he could not devote troops to an attack on the advancing vanguard without exposing his right flank to Mir Jafar's massive horde. All he could hope for was that Jafar would be good to his word, and with that, he turned his attention to the advancing right. At 8 AM, the cannonade began. The French and Bengalis fired a withering crescendo with their mounted cannons and field guns, wounding a handful of men. The British returned fire, but to little effect. Realizing he was sustaining too much damage, Clive orchestrated an orderly retreat back into the mango grove. The Franco-Bengali shelling continued, but the British were now well insulated. The perimeter ditch and the trees in the grove sheltered the men from cannonballs, while the wet mud absorbed the impact of those that struck the earth beneath them. From their sheltered position, the British artillery was able to more effectively return fire, killing several Bengali gunners and rendering their mounted cannons moribund. Meanwhile, Mir Jafar had not committed to the battle. Throughout the day, the back-and-forth artillery duel continued without either side gaining any ground, But Clive and his men were soon beset upon by a stroke of luck. At midnight, a thunderstorm erupted over the battlefield, drenching the Bengalis' powder and rendering their cannons useless for the time being. Meanwhile, the British guns had been covered in tarpaulins and were still operational. For hours, the British launched volley after volley into the helpless Bengali right, who were unable to return fire. Soon the rains began to abate, and the Bengalis leapt back into action. Mir Madon believed that the British had surely run out of ammunition by now, and advanced his cavalry in a line, preparing them to charge the British position. As it turns out, this was a fatal miscalculation, for as they advanced, Mir Madon was mortally wounded by a grape-shot cannonball. The general's unceremonious death was devastating to Siraj. He was running desperately short of loyal generals, while the capricious Jafar continued to do nothing. Knowing his position was precarious, Siraj threw himself at Jafar's feet and begged him to enter the fray. Jafar agreed, lying through his teeth, and left to prepare his men. Meanwhile, one of his fellow conspirators, Rai Dalab, whispered malicious advice into Siraj's ear, advising him to retreat. Thoroughly shaken by the death of Mir Madon, and realizing he was in a den of snakes, Siraj complied, and ordered a general withdrawal. Meanwhile, Jafar sent a correspondence to Clive, advising he attack now. The messenger, however, did not reach the British, unable to cross a battlefield still under heavy cannon fire. Nevertheless, the British took their own initiative. The Bengali retreat left the French artillery isolated in their position, causing one Major Kilpatrick to storm out of the mango grove with the 39th Regiment, charging the French position. He was quickly joined by Clive, and together they forced the French to retreat behind the Bengali entrenchment. Meanwhile, Mir Jafar was advancing on the left to join the British, but the British did not know it was him, so Clive dispatched 3 platoons to counter his approach. After the British fired a volley in their direction, Jafar stopped and bided his time. The tides had begun to turn. It was now the British gaining ground rapidly, while the Bengalis steadily lost it. Only a small portion of Siraj's army now actively fought back, as the rest simply departed from the battlefield, under the firm influence of Jafar and his conspirators. As the British advanced upon the water tanks, the last of the loyalist Bengalis took position on a nearby hillock, using it as a base to delay their approach with harassing cavalry raids, but they were repulsed each time by volleys of crackshot musket fire. The Frenchmen had retreated to the elevated redoubt built into the Bengali entrenchment, and from there engaged in another heated exchange of cannon fire with Clive and his artillery, who had advanced up to the water tank. Finally, Clive delivered the coup de grace, a 2-pronged attack. He ordered one Major Eyre Coote to storm the hillock, while the rest of his forces launched an open assault upon the French-held redoubt. This final assault proved decisive. The French were forced to withdraw, and what remained of Siraj's loyal troops were routed and put into full flight. The Battle of Plassey had been won by the British. Of the East India Company, only 22 soldiers lay dead. Among the Bengalis, 500. After the battle, Mir Jafar travelled to the British camp at Daudpur, where he was declared the new Nawab of Bengal. Siraj-ud-Dowlah had fled in disguise, but was caught and executed. Mir Jafar proved to be a fickle ally. Realizing correctly the British were an existential threat to his power, he made overtures to the Dutch to drive them out. This was thwarted by the British, who defeated the Dutch at the Battle of Chinsurah in 1759. Mir Jafar was then promptly deposed by the British. Meanwhile, the war with the French continued, and here the British emerged victorious too, successfully taking the final French stronghold of Pondicherry in 1763. The Treaty of Paris returned Pondicherry to the French in 1763, but they were contained to that port and never again gained the prominence they once had on the Indian subcontinent. With the British East India Company as the sole European power in India, they were more or less free to appoint and depose native puppet rulers at will. Troubling times lay ahead for India. Once again, thanks to Dragon Champions for...
Well, I think that's the end of the video. Yeah, it is. So, talk to you guys in the next video, and yeah. Subscribe to the channel when you get 1,000 subscribers by my birthday, September 13th. And also, thank you guys for, thank the subscriber that recommended this video for recommending this video. Also, you can recommend me videos in the comment section down below, and I will react to them. Talk to you guys in the next video, and peace.